Okay, my name is Jason Marcus Durant. Um, this is gonna be an unscripted video about something I feel like I really need to make a video about, and although my series is at this time of the recording is basically totally unknown, um, uh, if God forbid it ever does get known, um, I want this to be time stamp, so to speak, um, on an issue that I think would definitely come up if my series did gain any kind of popularity. Now, basically, what this video is going to be about is the uncanny um, level of similarities between my series, my saga, my epic saga, the Conqueror of the Sun series, and Game of Thrones, or the book version, A Song of Ice and Fire. um, First things I want to say right off the bat, um, and granted, this is basically taking my word for it. It would be, I know the truth of the matter. It would be very hard to actually prove it, but all I can say is the content of this video. I'm gonna be telling the truth. It's not made up. I'm not trying to rewrite history or anything like that. um, but again, this is one of the reasons I'm trying to put this video out now, even if the series ever gets popular. Um, so uh, let me start off with saying where basically I originally um, created my Conquer of the Sun series was originally going to be 5 books, and from my looking into R.R. Martin, he originally was going to have 3 books, and then it ended up to 7 books, and mine was always going to be 5 books from the start. I already knew that, and basically the entire 5 book series was formulated during my freshman year of high school, which was 1990 to 1991. Now, it's kind of hard to remember even earlier than that. I have very vague memories of like 8th grade at this point, but I did have inklings of the idea, certainly major components, like the main character, Sean Orc. Although I think originally his first name was something different. Um, but that pretty soon got solidified to Sean Arc. The last name Arc was always going to be the case. So that was there from at least 1990, 1991. Um, so that's, I mean, as I said, take my word for it, but that is the truth of the matter. Now, the second thing I want to get right off the bat is during the period when the Game of Thrones HBO TV show was taking off, I mean, like you couldn't exist anywhere than underneath a rock, so to speak, and not have heard about this series. I mean, basically, it's apparently still maybe one of the most popular TV series ever made and highest budget and all that kind of stuff. Um, but so I was aware of the series, and I had friends that were really into the series. I had one friend in particular that, by the way, helped me realize the design for the IRF symbol that's on the video screen, which gonna get to that. That's another one little issue I'm gonna touch on that. There's other coincidence that people will probably say if the series ever becomes popular, maybe I copied from somebody, but really the origins of my ideas are actually prior to these would-be claims. But so I was aware of the Game of Thrones series. Um, uh, I wasn't interested though, despite all the popularity, all the hype, all the talk about it. Like you couldn't go anywhere. Like it was like literally the entire world was watching it. It'd always come up in topics, and you could be talking about whatever subject you want, and then somebody would say, "Oh, you see the last episode of Game of Thrones? That was so cool, and what's gonna happen next?" I didn't I didn't, I wasn't pulled in to even attempting to watch it. Uh, I mean, it's kind of hard to say why, but I think one of the big reasons would be that um, I do like medieval and fantasy settings, but generally I prefer them in a video game medium instead of like a movie or a book. I've never been too big of a fan of, fantasy stuff um, in the book written form or movie form. Well, I mean, there's some exceptions in movies. But for example, I've never been a fan of the Tolkien series. I know everybody loves it. Sorry that I'm not the same as everybody else, but yeah, I didn't really like that series. I can make a point about that, maybe some ideas of why later. But so let me also just get it out here. I only actually watched through the entire series of Game of Thrones. It's even I can't even my mind's a little bit fuzzy right now, but it was basically the first time I ever watched even a full episode of Game of Thrones was um in winter of 2020. Um, if I had to take a guess, I want to say, I don't know, October, November, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but somewhere in that time frame. So very recently, um, and I will also take a note here that my original 7 books series, the main 5 books and the 2 prequels, were all published on the exact same day, which was in December of 2019. So this is like a year, basically a year later, that I actually learned all of the story of Game of Thrones. Whenever, now going back to kind of the history of me hearing about Game of Thrones, I hear people talk about it, but I didn't really have any interest in it. But after a certain time period, it just seemed like it was so popular that, like, I at least, even if I have this bias against fantasy medieval settings and in more of the visual formats, um, like, uh, and I'm usually right about my feelings if I'm gonna kind of judge things on the surface, where I'm gonna like watching this movie or TV show. Um, of course, not all the time, but I usually am. Still, besides even having that experience and knowing that ratio, um, like there's a certain point where something gets so popular where even though, okay, probably not gonna like it, but it, I just kind of feel like I owe it to, giving people the benefit of the doubt or whatever to, and even just personally for me to actually give it a try. Um, Now my try on Game of Thrones, that would be hard to say, but it's not too relevant because basically I only watched parts, like a few scenes. I probably watched a couple of minutes worth of uh, um one of the episodes of Game of Thrones. If I remember correctly, it was um the part, like I remember seeing the part where what's his name? Joffrey. Joffrey is showing what's that star? One of the Stark girls is the one that he's supposed to marry. I forget the name. Like all the beheaded heads and her father's head there too. Um, and that seemed like kind of the stereotypical fantasy kind of conqueror stories and stuff like that. And like essentially, I kind of basically stopped right there. So I literally only saw like minutes. So even though yes, I did try watching the series before my full viewing of it at the end of 2020. What year this was, I can't exactly remember. If I mean years and years ago, before my series was published. But uh, again, like I said, I had these couple of minutes with the scenes, and I knew basically nothing else about the series. When I watched the series for the first time, despite all of the talk around me, I would never get involved in this situation. In fact, sometimes I would, walk away or change channels on the internet or whatever it was because I wasn't interested. Um, but basically, when I finally watched the series, just to give you an idea of basically what my knowledge was, I had no. When I saw the ice wall on the first episode, I thought that scene was really visually was really amazing, but I didn't even know that it existed until I saw that in the first episode. So that should give you some idea of how little, basically nothing that I knew about the series. The only things, some things that would be inescapable, I guess, was of course the iconic Iron Throne. I was aware of that. I knew what it looked like. Um, and the character Jon Snow, you couldn't avoid being on the internet and not seeing what he looked like and him being a really popular character. Um, so I was aware of that, Jon Snow and the Iron Throne, and that's essentially it, really, to be honest. I wasn't aware of anything else. I knew obviously it's kind of going to be about this, um, you know, battle and succession of kings kind of story. That was kind of obvious, and that's usually how these kind of stories are. Which just one side note about me having a bias against kind of fantasy and medieval type stories in books or movies. Um, when it's historically accurate medieval kind of stories, I like that in film and books. But for some reason, when the fantasy element comes into it, I don't enjoy it as much. Even though, like in a video game medium, I do really enjoy it. It's kind of weird, but this was but this weirdness and this personality quirk or whatever you want to call it was one of the major reasons I didn't watch it and didn't know anything about the series. Um, so uh, uh, so let me also say I should have said this earlier, but this video is gonna be full of major spoilers. Um, I don't think you really need to say spoilers for Game of Thrones at this point, but for my series, it's gonna be major spoilers. So if you've discovered the series and listened to this video, you don't want to know. Probably shouldn't, or be prepared. I mean, the main point is to talk about these contentious points about my series and Game of Thrones. But inevitably, I'm gonna have to do some spoilers in order to kind of, state my case. um, but anyways, so uh, one really big example, which basically everybody knew about at the beginning when the first seasons of Game of Thrones, but again, this is just to illustrate how unaware I was of Game of Thrones, uh, like content and themes or subject matter and even the controversies that were involved in it. So when I with my series, with the Conqueror of the Sun series, a couple of things that I wanted to do. I was an English literature major, and I focused mostly on British authors, and specifically Shakespeare was definitely my main author of study. Definitely highly influenced, and when I was in early years of high school, I actually thought Shakespeare was overrated and stuff like that. Of course, I hadn't really read a lot of his stuff, and I didn't, I really didn't understand because of that, the kind of the older English. But when I was in university, I, I had really excellent professors, and so I really understood it a lot and appreciated it. And Shakespeare definitely deserves his reputation. Um, and I specifically like his tragedies, and you can kind of see this in my series too, because basically, they're most of the books are kind of tragedies. One thing so I'm aware of a lot of literature being, a literature major and stuff like that, and just stories in general, like even around the world, not just Western stuff. As anybody that's seen my stories, I mean, I used to live in Japan, so I have a lot of knowledge about that as well, and a lot of their stories and myths and legends as well. One thing that I wanted to do with my series, maybe it's not really even a conscious thing, but I wanted to, from the very beginning, I knew the story had to be from the quote bad guy's perspective, which is almost never done in stories. I mean, it's not like it's never been done, but it's very rarely done. So that was one thing that I definitely wanted to do, to do something different. Um, and there's other reasons because of some of the messages, which we'll get to when we come to more of these kind of coincidental similarities between Game of Thrones and Conquer the Sun. And I'm just to know, I'm gonna refer to Games of Thrones because it's just easier to say that than it is to say the book title. But so going back to the knowledge I had before watching the series in 2020, winter 2020, which is almost a year after I published my 7 books. Um, so just to recap, I knew about the throne, I knew about Jon Snow, but that was about it. The ice wall, the first time I saw it, was the first time I learned about it. I so I heard some stuff, but never, and digged a little bit, but not too much. Um, about that the story had incest in it. Anybody that's read my story, there's definitely a lot of that. Um, and again, I thought, hey, love stories have been done a million times already throughout storytelling history. Um, it's not like you can't make like you can definitely tier love stories throughout history, even the normal ones that are, non-blood related or whatever. Um, but just for the sake of doing something different, um, why it's not the reason for. I mean, some people do think I'm kind of contrarian, and maybe to some degree I am, but the reason to do things different isn't necessarily be different just to be different, but why repeat the same thing over and over and over again? If stuff's already been done, I don't want to do stuff that's already been done. I want to do stuff that hasn't been done. So that's more how my thinking and feeling on that goes. Um, so that's one of the kind of the big reasons why I wanted, um, like incest had to be uh, a big part of the story. Um, and basically, I heard about it a little bit about Game of Thrones, but not until I actually watched the series did I really know the extent of it. Like, only when I watched the series did I know, okay, it's they actually have this brother and sister, blood related brother and sister couple. Not only that, they're twins, which I didn't know that prior to actually watching the series. And much like in my series, the quote. I mean, people. This is probably going to be contentious, but the the ancestral relationships are consensual. They want it to happen. Uh, Maybe society knows it is taboo, but they don't really care. Because that's basically the same in my story as well. Um, so in that, in like incest has also been done in some other stories, although very rarely. It almost seems like a topic that authors are kind of afraid to even touch. Dare I say? I mean, I don't know how to explain it if it's not done more often. Especially what I was just explaining about. If something's not done, that's your opportunity to do something different. But I don't know, it's just not done, I guess. And I guess people are grossed out about it because they think about their real family members or whatever, I guess. But ultimately, this is just storytelling, it's fiction. Whatever implications you make of it as a reader, it's kind of on you. Um, to me, it's interesting because it's different, and there are certain dynamics you can create between characters with the fact that a couple is incestuous that you can't create any other way in writing or storytelling. I don't care how imaginative you are, there is no way to create these certain kinds of dynamics that you could have and certain situations that you have where the couple is incestuous and it's not just like a regular love triangle that everybody's non-blood related. So, but anyways, going back to the Game of Thrones, so the incest thing, like I'd heard stuff, I vaguely tried to research it, but I didn't really look into it. Like basically, I knew that there was some incest, but I didn't even know what form. I think I heard it was brother and sister, but that's about it. That's the extent. So I didn't know they were twins. I didn't know that they really really loved each other. Um, and really wanted each other. That all learned only in winter 2020 when I actually finally watched through the whole series. Um, so yeah, this is just to try to summarize how little I knew about Game of Thrones. So yes, Game of Thrones had been going on and the talk of the world basically, prior to the publishing of my series. But I somehow still remain, extremely ignorant basically of not even just the details, of course the details, but a large portion of even major parts of the story. I remember I think I vaguely heard about the Bloody Wedding, but I didn't know what exactly even happened. So when I watched the scene, it was pretty good. I thought it was pretty amazing and unexpected. It was a good scene. Um, but I didn't know the details until I watched it in winter 2020. Um, so, anyways, just to kind of summarize what I've been trying to talk about, and the point of this video is what I want to kind of show is that even though if people do start reading the story and if it does reach any kind of popularity, uh, people are undoubtedly gonna call like ripoff or copying of Game of Thrones. Uh, for example, although so in Game of Thrones, Jaime and Cersei's aren't like the main characters of the series. I think it's pretty obvious the Stark family is more kind of the main characters, and like Jon Snow is kind of really the main character. um, in my series, the main two characters of the entire series is Sean and Sabrina Ark. They are brother and sister. They fuck each other. They consensually they love each other. They want to stay together. They love each other more than anybody else, and they don't want any other kind of relationship. Well, Sean, well, that's Sabrina's case. Sean is. Uh, uh, I won't. I don't want to get into it right now because it's not really the point of the video. But he's uh, unfaithful at times, but there's reasons for that. But the point here is that basically so people might make comparisons or call ripoff or whatever uh, when they discover the characters of Sean and Sabrina Ark and say, "Oh, you just copied Jamie and Cersei's." Uh, the thing is going back to what I said at the beginning of the story or the video. I'm sorry. Where you know I came up with the idea of my series, and from the beginning there was going to be this. Sean and Sabrina were going to be the two main characters, and they were going to be brother and sister, and they were going to be sisters. This was back in 1990 and 1991, which, one thing that I did like about watching the Game of Thrones series is that because I had so little knowledge before about watching that, when I was releasing my book, I've always had these fears that people are just gonna close the book once it gets to the incest part, the reveal. So, which in my story doesn't really even happen until like halfway through the first book. Um, so I was, I knew how most people would kind of react to that, but seeing that Game of Thrones could have that but still be super popular was encouraging to me. So I'm glad I watched it, and I'm glad I also watched it too because now I can kind of address this issue of where maybe in the future people, if my series ever gets noticed, people are gonna copy or rip off. Well, as I said at the beginning of the video, my original concept, first five books, was almost instantly all generated in 19, definitely by 1991. Now, when I saw so many similarities between after watching Game of Thrones at Winter 2020, I then felt compelled to start looking into the actual original author R.R. Martin. And so I started watching a lot of his videos, interviews, and stuff like that. And then researching about his series because I'd never read his books before either. Um, so it turns out that his first book of his series, the book versions, was published in 1996. So this is already after um, I've generated my first five books in my head, at least. Okay, uh, they weren't completed by that time, but I, the basic storyline was all the main points of it was all done, and I'd already started working on the first novel. I, I think I was at least halfway done with the first novel by 1996. So, yeah. Um, this is where like I don't know what you're gonna say, the uncanny or coincidental thing comes out is because technically, yes, my stuff is just barely before even probably the first inklings of R.R. Martin's ideas. So apparently the story goes for R.R. Martin is that he started working on it in 1991, which I've said I created my idea 1990, 1991 in that time frame. The story goes, and he did it actually at apparently summer of 1991. Um, so I would say technically, um, and like I said, going, I'm pretty sure even in eighth grade I had at least some of the main, like the Sean arc type character. I knew that was going to be a thing already then, but the whole 5 books kind of formed in my freshman year of high school. Um, so it's right about the same time, and I mean, again, people would have to take my word for it. I don't know. Maybe there is some way to prove it, but I'm not sure, and I think it would be hard regardless, and no way to really absolutely prove it. But basically, on a very technical level, and maybe a very small margin, my lot of the concepts that are in Game of Thrones was already created in my head before R.R. Martin started working on his story. And the story goes too, he just was just imagining the part about the direwolf and Jon Snow and stuff like that. So whether he already had the incest ideas in there, who knows? But that was in the beginning for mine. So um, so having like these major characters of Cersei and Jamie, and then my characters of Sean and Sabrina, like I think pretty undoubtedly mine came first. Now, this is just all dealing with the time frame that this is happening. I definitely, well, I not only was I not aware of R.R. Martin's works until basically I only looked into his stuff with the TV show in winter 2020. I was completely unaware of any kind of really similarities in our two series and our two sagas until that time. But going back, after I watch it and doing research and stuff like that, I see how close it is, and it's really hard to describe. It's like like I said, I technically feel like my ideas came first, um, but it's still very close. That's not arguable. And that's really strange to me because, like I was saying earlier, is one of the reasons I was doing some of the stuff I did in my story and what was done in Game of Thrones is because I didn't see a lot of it in other stories. So, um, I guess R. Martin, I don't know exactly what his exact motivations are, um, but like it's just it's in some ways it's actually makes me mad and frustrated because w- one of the major things I was hoping to do here is get something a new kind of story, a story that's different. It's not the same as all the other stories that have been told 100 times over in just slightly different formats and stuff like that. But um I mean, it's really neither of our faults. It's just RNG or whatever you want to say that just happens that two authors um, at about the same time created two, both ending up as 7 book sagas. Or at the time of this recording, R.R. Martin still hasn't finished the last 2 books of his series, or his main series. Um, but like, there's that similarity. There's incest stuff. And another thing that from watching interviews with him, what he talked about. Now, I wouldn't really put it in the terms he did, but it's definitely close. One of the things he says is the main kind of things that he even likes to do in his stories is have morally gray characters. Um, now, and basically it seems like he says that that's really the, the kind of the main point of or theme of or message of the story, that hey, the bad guys are 100% bad and the good guys are 100% good. um, so this in my story, actually, it's in this case it's a little bit cliched, but it's done differently because, well, so the biggest theme that I actually love, and love conquers all. Now that's nothing new right there, but like it's it's done different because uh of the incest angle put onto it. So to me, that I think it makes it a little bit more different and so-called quote refreshing, um, than um, the love story that's been told a million times over, right? Um, that would be my main thing. The other thing that I wanted to do was, like I mentioned earlier, it's always going to be written from the bad guy's perspective. The reason is because you're supposed to see that there's some good in the bad guy characters. Now, I guess that technically, I mean, yes, morally great characters, but it, I mean, that term is used a lot in literature and stuff like that. But I wasn't really setting out to do morally great characters. Like, I wanted to specifically point out it's not just because R. R. Martin says he also wanted to show the good characters had some bad sides to them, which, I mean, maybe not overtly done, but that's often done in stories already. Um, what I see very little being done throughout all of essentially storytelling is trying to show that the good guys, or I mean the bad guys, have some good in them. And they're not actually human. They're not literal demons or Satan or anything like that. So that's the second major like point or message or theme that I'm trying to get across in my series. Um, so that, I mean, it's a little bit different, but still very similar to what R. R. Martin's talking about morally gray characters. Now, I mean, he talks about this, and he talks about like how the good guys have some bad in them too. But and granted, I haven't read the book version, but and I know definitely, as a lot of people said, the TV series went to kind of shit at one point, basically when they ran out of the book. But a lot of it's still supposedly very accurate. I have a good friend that's read the books as well, so he knows the comparisons and stuff, and I've talked to him a lot about it. Um, but really, I mean, the Starks are really kind of stereotypically bad. Like some of the, I mean, I'm sorry, stereotypically good, and there's not really a lot of bad to them, really. Uh, there's been mention even by R. R. Martin himself, like Ned being kind of his goodness, making him naive, and then making him make these bad decisions that led to his beheading. But that's still the whole naivety good thing. That's still associated with good. That's not really I did something evil and then therefore I, fucked up and got in my head beheaded. Um, so it's kind of I don't see that much of the good guys being morally gray. Which, I don't really care about that. Like, what the entire reason my series is from specifically, you know, dead center target is from the bad guy's perspective is because I feel like that's almost not that it's never been done, but it's rarely been done, and certainly not enough attention has been drawn to that concept of hey, even the most vicious bad guys, they're still human. They still have good sides. They're still capable of love, like deep, real, meaningful love. They're not just anger and hatred purely and incapable of any other human emotion. Um, so I would say that's kind of different compared to R. R. Martin's version. My good guys are pretty good as well, but it rarely focuses on the good guy characters. And there's definitely times where I do actually show the good guy characters being morally gray, but in a real matter, kind of not like this Ned Stark example, but like the case where there's a case in my story where um, the quote good guys sometimes try some of the IRF without a they execute them without a trial, and most people would consider that, at least in American Western society, that's considered very unethical, and so that happens. Um, and just again on the point of uh, good guys doing bad things in Game of Thrones, like people also mention what I guess it's Sansa Stark. Uh, but again, I would have to say that a lot of her quote bad things is they point out about, oh, well, she fell in love with Joffrey and stuff and didn't really realize he was going to be this evil guy and stuff like that. That again falls under the trope of the naivety of good people. It's not really that she did something bad, uh, like consciously, and with a solid choice of mind and experience. Um, but it's just the kind of stereotypical naivety. Anyways, um, so so one thing, so as I watched the series, so a couple of things that really were kind of similar. So, and the reason these really stick out to me is because these were very specific points that were major themes in my story, and apparently also in R. R. Martin's story. So this is why I want to kind of deal with this. And the main things, as I'll now kind of summarize, is the incest relationships, and as Martin puts it, morally gray. But mine's is more focused on the bad guys solely, and seeing if you can find any good in them, or realizing there's good in them. They're capable of love, and they're actually human. Um, and maybe even to have some sympathy for them. So those those two things I think I would get called, if my series ever gets noticed or recognized and to any degree popular. Those are two of the main things that I think people would try to call out as a ripoff of Game of Thrones. But as I've laid out since the beginning of the video, is I had these ideas, even in theory, from as best I gathered. Who knows exactly what was going in his mind before the summer of 1991? But like basically, I had my entire 5 book series all planned out with definitely these major themes. The bad guy's perspective, that was always going to be the case. Sean and Sabrina were the main characters, and they were always going to be brother and sister, and they're always going to be incestuous. So that was a that. So the kind of the biggest points that people might call as copy or ripoff, like to a 99.999% chance, I'm pretty sure that I had the idea before R. R. Martin even has an idea, let alone like the official record is he published in 1996, and the story goes he started in 1991. But like I basically had it even before that. Maybe not by much, but it's still technically before. Now, as I've also said in this video, uh, from that time, from 1990 to 2020, I knew nothing about his series. And the only time I fully, actually, delved into the series was in the winter of 2020. So, essentially, not only am I saying that technically I had these ideas first, but during the whole creative and writing process from my side, none of it was so-called tainted by the influence of Game of Thrones or Song of Ice and Fire. Like zero, because I had zero awareness of it, and I've already mentioned the very very few things that I knew about Game of Thrones before actually watching the series, which was basically Jon Snow and the Iron Throne. That's about it. That's all I really know about the series before Winter 2020. Um, so basically, there's well, I'm pretty confident here. I could say too that basically there's zero influence from Game of Thrones uh, and or Song of Ice and Fire for my 7 book series, The Conqueror the Sun. So that's that's the major point of the video is to show that technically I'm pretty firmly believe and pretty sure that I had my ideas on these major themes before R.R. Martin, and none of his work, despite the popularity that it gained, influenced my story because I had basically zero knowledge of it. Um, so, but those are the 2 major things. If I was trying to think of other stuff, so other things that would be similar is, well, I mean, technically it's a kingdom in Game of Thrones, but a big part, and I even considered it a character basically in my series, even though it's not human, but the uh, the IRF Empire, which IRF stands for International Rebellion for Freedom, um, but I usually just shorten to IRF, not just for the name length, but I mean, truth be told, I created the initials first, simply because essentially I like the acoustic and and visual aesthetics of those 3 letters. So, and then I had to create words to fit the initials afterwards. I'm not like it definitely fits, especially when you're looking at the book 1. Sean Ark himself explains why he names that way, and it fits for that. Now, when it becomes a big empire, sure, it actually still kind of fits with his Sean Ark's vision, but people might say it's a little contrived or whatever, um, or doesn't fit like an empire. But again, this is one of the points, and Sean Ark also mentions this in his first book, where he's just kind of recently met Sarah, or well, she's not an Ark yet, but to meet Sarah and talking about that he does this kind of arms dealing stuff, and like he's flat out admit that he's basically selling weapons to quote terrorists. But then he points out like during the American Revolutionary War, uh, the quote Americans or revolutionaries would be the insurgents or terrorists, and the British is actually the good guys, so to speak, and the Americans are the terrorists. Um, and then there's that, he brings up that famous thing too about, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So, like, I still think it works. I'm not 100% happy. I'm not as pleased personally. I mean, everybody can have their own opinion, but uh, the IRF initials, the acoustic feel that I get off of it, and visual aesthetics that I get off of it, I really like. I don't think really the name is as cool as spelled out, but the concept is still fitting, um, in line with Sean Rick's visions and stuff. Anyways, so, but the point here is that the IRF Empire is like a major character essentially of the entire series. It's basically involved in all of the books, not just the 7 books, but basically all of the side books, even at points where, like my first side book that's been published now, The Cursed Princess, at the end of book 4, which that's when The Cursed Princess takes place, is right after the end of book 4, the IRF Empire is completely defeated on Earth. And so it doesn't really exist, but there's the remnants, and so it's still and part of the royalty. So because Anna Ark is still alive, and it's the remnants still believe in the empire and believe that one day it's going to come back. So even in the stories, the side books, and I already have some other side books that are going to take off from the Cursed Princess. I already have at least 2 books that are going to follow chronologically, right? What happens right at the end of Cursed Princess, where it's kind of hinted on, but J-Sark is going to be working on making a general AI. And then a book after that is going to be focusing on kind of stuff that I briefly mentioned in book 5 about humans' progress into space. And so now, if I'm going to be following this timeline and story, I'm going to have to detail it. So before jump gate technology gets invented in my series, uh, I I wanted to do the story about generational ships. So I already have an idea for that laid out. And then both of those stories also are going to deal with why there's no AI in book 5, which is like 700 years into the future. um, but anyways, so going back to the comparisons between Game of Thrones and Conquer the Sun, so I guess you could probably say, and maybe people say it's copying and ripoff and all that kind of stuff, that hey, there's the 7 kingdoms of Westeros and the Tsar Empire. Definitely, those are very similar. I mean, obviously a little bit different, but um, where I mean, in his case, it's specifically a monarch, and mine is specifically an empire. Which the distinction between that is also not very much, but they're still supposed to be different, and even in just the feel of it, too, uh, as just public consciousness or the reader conscious, and so whatever technical distance exists, I think there's still a distinct difference between those two in most people's minds. Um, and then other things. So, and there's a lot of my scenes take place in the throne rooms, the IRF throne rooms, and stuff like that. So people might call a copy on that. Now, on the throne itself, like I don't have any, fancy throne. I think I actually don't even recall. Well, I think I do describe in the book the very first IRF throne that's created, which is created in the IRF Sunrise Palace that's in the Nevada deserts. That throne is the very first throne that gets created in the IRF Empire, and it's made out of solid gold. Now, personally, I realize gold is kind of this ageless, most valuable kind of element of all human history. But that's actually kind of one of the reasons I didn't want to use it. And I prefer actually the look of silver over gold. But since I'm working with this theme of Conqueror the Sun, and by the way, one big thing, my story, there's 2 very famous stories from long ago history where my story is very analogous to. One is the Icarus story. Um, that's replete throughout the entire series. It's just multiple times in multiple different ways, and multiple different metaphors, you know, mirroring that story and that kind of message about you know trying to go for everything and it not really working out. Um, so there's that, and there's also the Isis and Osiris story, and that shows mainly up in the form of Sabrina and Sean Arc. Um, because Isis and Osiris were also brother and sister. They were gods, but they were also brother and sister, and they were husband and wife slash lovers. So that and um, well, the Icarus thing was to a degree definitely conscious. The Isis thing wasn't. I knew I was gonna have the main character to be brother and sister and incestuous and lovers relationship, but that it somehow fit so well into that and analogous with the Isis and Osiris story was not conscious. That just kind of turned out that way. I mean, probably it was subconscious and maybe even archetypal, but whatever. So, so let me just think here for a second, though. But so again, coming to these comparisons between Game of Thrones and Conquer the Sun. So yeah, you have the whole kingdoms empire thing. So you have all this kind of political intrigue. Now, one thing that I would say that's quite different here is um, in in Game of Thrones, there's a whole bunch of different factions. I mean, generally, it's the main is like the seven kingdoms of Westeros, and it's supposed to be under one king slash queen. So that's very similar to our Empire, but there's a lot of strife in between uh, the houses of the kingdom. Whereas in my story, the IRF is very solid, very rigid, very strong. There's kind of there's no really fighting over the throne. The only way it kind of happens a little bit, which is, I mean, there's a big part of that story, but in book four, when Jareth is wanting to take over the throne that her mother sits on because she's not managing the empire well, um, that's about the only kind of thing that happens throughout essentially any of the books of my series, including side books. So I don't really do that too much. Again, because even though you're dealing with empires and stuff like this, and then in my story, there is a good guy faction, and originally it's when Shonark's trying to conquer the whole Earth. Originally, the countries are fighting kind of separately, but eventually they form the fighting axis and unite as one against the IRF. So then and pretty much from that point on, for the rest of the series, even into the fifth book where it's 700 years in the future, it's basically this one-on-one kind of fight. So there's just only two factions. So that's quite different. And I mean, I can admit that, having multiple factions kind of definitely is essentially intrinsically more interesting. So whatever, kudos to R. R. Martin, but it's not hard to do at the same time. It's not, if you are into world building, which both of us definitely seem to be into, um, it's not that hard. You just have to sit down and think a little bit. But that's not the direction I wanted to go. The main focus was supposed to be solely, basically, almost. I mean, I have to refer to the good guys sometimes, but and then give their perspective sometimes. But like anybody that reads the series will see that it's like 90% of the time the focus is specifically focused on the quote bad guy's perspective. Not only that, but since it is kind of done in a bad guy's perspective, even like the narrative and omniscient kind of viewpoints that I use, like I heard R. Martin talking about he only likes to use, first-hand account kind of viewpoints and doesn't like the omniscient thing. Um, that does have definitely its advantages, but there's also a lot of disadvantages and it has its charm. But I just felt like, especially to get to the points that I want in my story, like I'm not gonna limit myself to first person or third person, whatever. I think you're basically leaving a bunch of tools out of your toolbox if you're not using that. Again, there is some advantages that you do get by not using all the tools and some charm, so to speak. But anyways, so even from these so-called objective perspectives, like I definitely still tilt it basically saying that, looking at the good guys, I mean, looking at the bad guys, the IRF, but in a good light. From their viewpoint, they are the good guys, basically. Um, so that's um, why. That's basically why I didn't want to have a whole bunch of different other factions, even though that might make things interesting. Um, and even the fact that there's just good, one other faction to represent the good side, that's not to oversimplify it and make this, dark versus light, direct conflict. It's more because I'm trying to, as least as possible, focus on any parts of the good guy side and put it solely on the bad guy side. So I don't, not only do I not need it, but I don't want a lot of other factions in there. Um, and anybody that sees, there's definitely uh, a lot of drama that even happens within the IRF and the royalty. And one of the big reasons for this happening is actually because of the incest stuff. And this is what I was saying earlier, where one of the reasons I wanted to have in my story is because it creates dynamics that you can't create any other way, which is something different and not done a lot in a lot of storytelling so far. Except in this example of Game of Thrones. Now, I mean, there's probably a lot of other things I can't really. I mean, I've covered the main things that people would probably call out as copying, uh, as far as my series goes compared to Game of Thrones. Um, I'm sure there's a lot of other things, and I do recall kind of noting in my while I was watching Game of Thrones, but can't really remember them right now. Like I said, this is unscripted, but there's still, I'm sure there's a lot of other ones, but they're more minor. Um, but either way, what I want to kind of more finish with in this video, I guess, is I'm kind of mind blown of like, so people, I want to address the whole, copy or rip off issue, which I mean, well, regardless of if anybody believes me or not, I know what the truth of the situation is. So I'm confident in it, in that situation, is even if other people aren't. But um, there's a different aspect that's just kind of mind blowing in a lot of ways. In some ways, like I said, there's actually a little bit of anger and frustration, but like how many times in history, especially because both of the both of our stories are kind of doing something different that hasn't really been done a lot. I mean, these two major things that I've really pointed out, the incest stuff in both stories, specifically a brother and sister, and is being kind of the main characters, and the morally gray thing, or the bad guys do have some good, or maybe you can understand some of the reasons the bad guys are the way they are, or make the decisions they make. So those two things, and I think pretty much anybody that's really familiar with a lot of different stories and literature and all that kind of stuff, it's not that it's never been done, but it's rarely been done. So I'm just, there's a frustration and anger because I thought, you know, I'm not going to claim that I'm a super great writer, especially in the technical level. I think I'm a good storyteller, but maybe uh, need. I wish I had some more natural talent or skill, so to speak, with the actual technical side of the writing. But ideally, I wish my story, I think, would be best in a visual medium too. So like, movies or miniseries or whatever. So that's another coincidence there. And like I said before, there was no influence, and not only have I described my side of there was zero influence from Game of Thrones into my series, but since even now my series is basically unknown and I have zero history as an author prior to dumping these 7 books all in one day. So, and self-publishing, so I have no, big publishing house to help get the word out. But basically, obviously, R.R. Martin was not influenced at all by my Conqueror of the Sun series either. So both, even though whatever people want to say how similar these stories are, and whoever wants to say is who copied who, it's not really a case it's copied on either side because both stories clearly, uh, uh, were created and evolved completely independently and oblivious of each other. So, I'm not really even trying to take sides here. The only point that I would say is like I think it's like I said, 99.9% sure that if somehow there was some knowledge from R.R. Martin's side of my series, which there definitely wasn't, if there was, mine did technically come first. Um, Granted, that's pretty much gonna take my word for it, but all I can say is that I am telling the truth. People don't have to believe me, but I guess. Um, but the real truth is that basically both of the stories were independently kind of developing almost on the same timeline. Um, Although my 7 book series is finished and his is not. Although it's finished in a way because of the Game of Thrones, but uh, a TV series. Although how he actually he's probably gonna have things different in those 2 books. Um, but yeah, so like to a degree, I'm mad that uh, here I thought I'm gonna do something really different, and it turns out somebody already was basically at the same time. Um, but one of the reasons for doing something different, like I want people to talk about these stuff that people don't want to talk about normally, basically. So if there's somebody else that can get these kind of conversations and debates going, that's what I'm wanting too. So that's a good thing. And even if my series never becomes popular, or known, even like at least somebody's gotten some of these messages across that I wanted to get across. He doesn't really the biggest theme or message of the story is really about love, actually. Ironically, even though it's supposed to be the bad guys and major characters, this IRF dictatorial empire. Uh, but that's supposed to be a point. That's one of the points that seems like in real contrast to each other, but the point is that the good guys still are capable of deep love, and from their perspective, they're just fighting for, and protecting their loved ones and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's definitely love and romance stuff in Game of Thrones, but like, I don't think it's necessarily a major theme of the series or intentional major theme. I mean, pretty much it exists in almost every story. There's usually some kind of love story, but for my series, it's actually supposed to be like the number one thing. So, so anyways, there's for me there's this, like some frustration, but not just on the idea that while somebody else was doing the same thing, even though I thought I was gonna do something new and refreshing that hadn't been done, uh, at least to the scale. So a lot of these things, like the gray thing and the incest thing, they've been done in other stories before, but not at a saga level. And this is more kind of crazy, coincidental, mind-blowing. Is that it's not just that we like one person has a saga, one person has a single book that had the same themes. It's that both of us have a saga, and it was always going to be a saga. Uh, in my case, uh, mine was always going to be 5 books. Now, apparently, the story for R.R. Martin is going to be 3 books originally. Then it became 7. Mine was always going to be 5. Then while I was writing the main 5 book series, I started to think, well, what happens to Sean and Sabrina arc before book 1? So I wanted to have like the background story for them. So I planned a prelude book or a prequel book, if you please. But then that book, when I got to like the 400-page mark, I knew that basically I would have to split it up into 2 books because I was nowhere near and close to finishing. Um, I guess together the books are, I think, not quite at 900 pages, but getting pretty close to 900 pages. And that's been done in books before, but um, I just kind of personally made this rule that I want to keep my books between 300 and 500 pages because I mean, some people, I mean, if the story's good, they'll read it even if it's 1,000 pages long. But like even that initial picking up the book in the first place, some people, including myself, might get turned off if the book is too long. Because if you're reading it for the first time, you don't know. Maybe especially if it's an unknown series, you don't know if it's going to be something you like or not. Do you want to spend that much time investment just to find out it's a series you don't like? So I try to deal with that. Um, so that's how my book series became uh, a 7 book series. Um, and so that's pretty crazy too. That it is, both series are exactly 7 books, and um, for the main story. I also have a whole bunch of side books, and R.R. Martin's already done some like prehistories too, um, which I wouldn't really say is the same as my prelude. I mean, it's definitely quote prequels, but where the main 5 books of my saga are kind of focused on kind of the war story, the conflict, the Irish Empire, and stuff like that. Um, the 2 Prelude to Destiny books are focused. It's a very fine microscope. It's the opposite of this huge empire scale, either on a global scale or a galactic scale. Now we're just looking at 2 single characters and like finely tuned with a microscope on those. So it's at opposite ends of the spectrum, basically, and that's the way I wanted it, and that's kind of the point. That's definitely what the Prelude to Destiny stories are supposed to be about. Now, originally, uh, it was actually going to be the plan for my series was going to be Prelude to Destiny 1 and 2 were going to be book 1 and 2, and then Seed of an Orchid was actually going to be book 3. But even when that was the original plan, I was always going to say that you're supposed to actually start reading for book 3. You're not supposed to read the prequel until after you really finish the main 5 books. But, and so I did stuff like put it, the prelude, and when I was developing the story and letting some people know about it, there was a lot of confusion about where to start, even though I had in the foreword telling you where to start and stuff like that. Um, People would miss that, of course. So then I said about putting it under its own sub-series, Chronicles series, which a lot of the side books that I have sub-series to them because they're different kind of categories, so to speak, types of side books that I'm going to be working on. And I categorize those too, basically for kind of reader's purpose, because certain kind of category will tell you what the book will be like. Um, Whereas basically in two examples of the War Chronicles and Alternate Light Chronicles, War Chronicles, as the name implies, will be more kind of like the traditional five books and focused on like wars on big scales, where Alternate Light books will be focused more on the characters, and more fine detailed kind of uh, on individual characters. Now, character interaction is always a big thing in all of my stories, regardless. But overall, for the story, those two sub-series, you will be able to know, even without reading a single word on the page, what kind of book it is. And then you can decide. I mean, some people like both, but then some people only like the action stories, and some people only like the character stories. So either way, readers can decide, simply by knowing the series, and I also color coded my series too. But so it's pretty crazy that all these coincidences. So there's definitely a lot of coincidences between Conqueror the Sun and Game of Thrones. But like I said, these were both completely independent. They are coincidences. They're not ripoffs of either way. And they're not copying off of either way. I just think it's pretty crazy because these are such kind of, you know, different than normal stories that's been done so much. Um, and then one way that is very different is bringing in, having all these controversial and taboo topics in it, which is very rarely done. And so the fact that that was the content of the stories, and they both ended up as sagas and separate books, that's really crazy. Um, and like I said, it just kind of upsets me because I thought I was doing something really original. But, you know, and also, well, if my series even gets fucking noticed at all, like, it, it, I already know that I'm gonna get called as a ripoff or a copy, even though that's not the case. And, whatever, it's not actually gonna affect me too much. I already know the truth of the situation, so it won't bother me really that much. And part of the point of doing this video now is to try to like give a time stamp, so to speak, on, even if the series does become complicated and these accusations do come out, I can point back to the video that's pre these arguments and accusations and say, yeah, I've already realized this, and here's the story about what the situation was, where both of these sagas were completely independent, as just basically literally mere coincidence. Um, and it's just crazy that it's pretty much in the same time frame as well. Um, we both started 90, 91 on the series, and well, like I said, he hasn't finished his book version yet. Mine was finished at the end of 2019. Again, before I actually watched Game of Thrones in 2020, winter 2020. One other thing I guess I'll say, I mean, I guess, like I said, I can't. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of other things that people would say that are copying a ripoff. I guess and I don't recall all of them because I've thought about it already. But I'm confident I can address them because I already know the history. I know both sides of the history. That, as I've been saying, it's both were independent, completely independent, and it's just merely coincidence. Um, but one other thing that I do want to address is I've already been called out on this. But again, I just want to establish with a kind of a timestamp, so to speak, um, that the image on the YouTube video of which is the IRF symbol, which again, the IRF empire is basically a character in my story. It's such a big part of the story that I consider it like a major character. So this symbol obviously symbolizes that empire, and so it's a big part of the series, and that's why it's on the covers and all that kind of stuff. Now, uh, so this, I mean, I've never seen this symbol exactly like this before. I've completely originally created it. Again, back in 1990 or 91 is when maybe even before that, I might have thought about it in 8th grade even. But either way, I've already had actually this friend that has actually also read Ice and Fire and the series, and so knows a lot about how similar they are or different. Um, he when he first saw the symbol, which he was actually helped me actually put it in physical form, because I knew exactly what the symbol looked like in my head, but I have like no drawing talent or skill whatsoever. Like I could draw stick figures. So even though the symbol's pretty simple, I basically had to have people help me realize it. And it's basically dead on to what I have pictured in my head. Like maybe the exact details of the scorpion would be even that's kind of a little fuzzy in my head, so it'd be hard to really think. But this is basically dead on to what I pictured in my head. There was always going to be the triangle symbol, and there was always going to be the circle. I think originally I didn't have the lines at the corner that make like a mini triangle within it. That wasn't originally in it, but I added that very soon after the original design. And I mean, we're talking maybe minutes or days at the most. And again, this is back in 1990, 1991. So, but anyways, my friend said, "Oh, hey, this looks like the nod symbol, which the nod symbol is from a video game series named Command and Conquer, which I've actually played that game, and I've even played the game, which is one of my favorite games actually, that quote started the so-called RTS genre, which was Dune 2, made by Westwood Studios, and then Command and Conquer was their kind of original IP, so to speak. But that game only came out in, let me just check my notes. I did have a couple of notes just to make sure I get this right. Well, technically Wikipedia pages on my other computer. So the first Command and Conquer game came out in 1995. So this is 4 years at least before after my symbol has already been created. So again, I guess it's once again take my word for it. All I can say is I don't know how exactly I can prove it. Maybe there's some way I haven't figured it out, or maybe even somebody could find a way that I haven't thought about. But all I can say is take my word for it. I am telling the truth. Whether people believe me or not, I guess that's up to them. But I know what the true story is. So, and actually, truth, I'll just put it aside. Truth is a really important issue to me. So I always, and very much against misinformation, and I'm very much in trying to be as accurate as possible. So uh, I'm not using that as a way to try to convince people of me actually telling the truth, but that's just a big core of who I am as a person. So regardless of whatever somebody thinks about what I'm saying is true or not. Um, so anyway, so if this whole, which it probably will, then nod comparison comes up, you know, I know mine came first, so it's not a ripoff. And again, it's not like Command and Conquer ripped off of my symbol because I didn't show my symbol, which is another thing I want to bring up, meant to bring up earlier. Again, the Game of Thrones and Conquer the Sun comparison, uh, and how they were completely independent. And obviously, because my series is not even known at this point, but it's even kind of a little bit further where R.R. Martin could have been influenced by my story in any way, because I never revealed the title to my series to anybody until like 1 month before I published. Uh, there was one case where when I was working, when I was going to the school, um, and I did this part-time job at the library, the and one of my coworkers, sometimes I was like, it was this very small library, it's dead all the time, so I'd usually just work on my books basically most of the time. Um, there was one time where, like, whenever I left it open, and one of my coworkers saw the title, but other than that, nobody knew. Like, I didn't even tell my ex about the title or anything, and literally nobody knew what the title of the series was, except for this one guy that probably forgot about it, never mentioned it to anybody, and then 1 month before I actually published it. So, besides just the series not being known, like, not even the title was known by anyone. So yeah, these were basically, the point is these were very independently created sagas and didn't really have any influence over each other at all, like zero. So, but anyways, so the nod thing might come up, but again, similar to how, like I've said, I started my series. Well, all 5 books were already planned in my head at 1990, 1991, and so was the symbol. So both predate when R.R. Martin started working on his book and when Command and Conquer made their nod symbol. Now, I don't know what their development cycle was, but back then, development cycles for games were much shorter than they are now. Like, but even if it's like 2 or 3 years, did they make the symbol right away? And in any case, I've got at least 4 years, so I highly doubt um, they they created that symbol. I can really check actually, when did Dune 2 come out? Because that was their first game. Okay, so that came out in 92, so that's already after I've created the IRF symbol. And since they were working on this Dune game, or just released it, I, I, or at least prior to this date, they probably didn't have a symbol yet even created. Even if they somehow did, like back in 91, which I very highly doubt. But either way, they were still independently developed. I kept my symbol also a pretty guarded secret for a very long time, until basically, obviously, really only publicly. I mean, people definitely saw the symbol over time throughout my life, friends and stuff like that, and but publicly only when the books got published in 2019. Now, obviously, there's a lot of years that have passed since when my symbol is created and the nod symbol. I'm aware of the callouts that people are going to say probably in the future, if the series ever even gets recognized, that, hey, you just ripped out the non-series. Well, as I explained, no, I didn't. It came out first. But there is also the issue, so why didn't you change it so you wouldn't get called out in the copyright? Well, because I created the idea first, and I know I did, and I'm confident I did, that it's my idea first, and not that they copied me either. The Nod symbol didn't copy because they weren't aware of my symbol, most likely. Um, Although I mean, I think it might have actually been on the internet even back then, because I did use this symbol a lot. I really protected the series title, but not the symbol, not as much. Um, so, there could be this argument about, why didn't you, or suggestion, why didn't you change the symbol? Because, this Command and Conquer series is pretty popular, so most people are going to know about that. Um, so, yeah, I mean, it's a good point or suggestion, but like I know, once again, I know I originally created this, and if somebody else, it'd be the same way if I somehow discovered while writing my Conqueror of the Sun series, I discovered the Fire and Ice and discovered all the similarities and said, oh, well, this is so similar. Never mind. Forget my whole story that's a 5-book series that's already planned out in my head. I'm just going to throw it away because I don't want to be seen as even accused as copying, even though my ideas were first. So, I mean, in that case, that obviously seems pretty ridiculous. In a symbol case, maybe not so much, but for me, it's not really any different. I created it first. There's there's no reason for me to change it. There's no reason for the other sides to change theirs either. But and I'm ready to address any claims that I copied or ripped off as one of the points of this video, actually, in fact. And also, ultimately, I don't care. If people really don't want to believe me, I know what the truth is. And, you can't force people to think certain ways. Like, I know I can't force, nor would I want to force anybody. But yeah, so ultimately I don't care, even if a lot of people are just gonna endlessly call it a ripoff and never believe, my testimony, so to speak, about how I actually came up with the symbol and these stories before both cases, the Command and Conquer symbol and R.R. Martin's saga story, and some of the kind of the main themes in that. Um, I think I'm gonna, since that is kind of the main point of the video, and I think I've pretty well covered that now, was about this kind of coincidental similarities between Games of Thrones and Conquer the Sun. I think I'm gonna end this video here, but there, I wanted to go into more detail, I guess, kind of maybe in relationship to the one of the major similarities, which is the incest stuff. But I think that would be, and it's somewhat connected, but it's still, I think, would be better in its kind of own video. To go more in depth about that. I don't think it's necessary to really go in depth more about the whole morally gray character stuff, because I've already covered that to the extent that it needs to be covered, I think. So yeah, anyways, I'll just end this video here and then make a separate video for going into more detail about that. So, end of line.